the 17th of January, 1942. The North Atlantic, 280 miles east of Cape Hatteras. The ocean was black glass beneath a moonless sky. Lieutenant Commander Karl Dönitz's U-boat captains called it Glückliche Zeit, the happy time. In the frozen silence of submarine warfare, happiness was measured in tonnage sent to the bottom. Oberleutnant Zur, C. Heinrich Bleichrott, stood in the conning tower of U-109, his binoculars sweeping the horizon. The wind carried the smell of salt and diesel fuel. Somewhere ahead, silhouetted against the glow of an American coastal city that refused to dim its lights, a tanker steamed northward. It moved alone, unescorted, unprotected, a gift wrapped in riveted steel. Bleichrott had been at sea for 43 days. He had sunk 6 ships. Each time, the pattern was identical. Surface under darkness, close to within 1,000 meters, fire a spread of torpedoes, watch the fireball climb into the night sky. No aircraft appeared. No destroyers came charging over the horizon with depth charges. The Americans, he noted in his log, seemed to be fighting a war without remembering the lessons of 1917. They sent their merchant ships into the Atlantic, like sheep wandering through a forest of wolves. The torpedo tubes were loaded. The executive officer called up the firing solution. Bleichrott gave the order, and 2 G7E electric torpedoes hissed into the water, leaving twin trails of bubbles that glowed faintly in the bioluminescence. 47 seconds later, the SS San Jose erupted in flame. Its cargo of aviation gasoline turned the tanker into a torch visible for 20 miles. Bleichrott watched through his binoculars as men leaped into the freezing water. He noted the time in his log, 0237 hours. Then U-109 slipped beneath the surface and turned east toward the next hunting ground. The Americans had no air patrols. None. Not in January 1942, not in February, not in March. The wolf packs were feasting. This was not supposed to happen. When Admiral Ernest King took command of the United States fleet in December 1941, he inherited a navy designed for a Pacific war, not an Atlantic siege. America's entry into World War II had been sudden, but the threat was not new. For 2 years, Britain had been bleeding merchant tonnage to German U-boats. Every month, convoys limped into Liverpool and Glasgow with fewer ships than had departed Halifax or New York. Winston Churchill would later write that the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war was the U-boat peril. If the Atlantic supply line was severed, Britain would starve. If Britain fell, the war was lost. The solution was obvious: air coverage. Aircraft could spot submarines on the surface, force them to dive, disrupt their attacks. Even the mere presence of a patrol plane overhead could scatter a wolf pack. The British had learned this in 1917, during the First World War, when the introduction of convoy escorts and air patrols had broken the back of the Kaiser's submarine campaign. By 1941, the Royal Air Force Coastal Command was flying long-range patrols over the eastern Atlantic, using Sunderland flying boats and American-built Catalinas to hunt U-boats. The system worked where the aircraft could reach. But there was a gap. A vast, yawning gap in the middle of the Atlantic, beyond the range of land-based planes. Churchill called it the Black Pit. The U-boats called it Paradise. The Americans, joining the war in December 1941, had the industrial capacity to build the planes. They had the shipyards to construct the escorts. They had the pilots training in Florida and California. What they did not have, in those first terrible months, was a system. Admiral King resisted the convoy system, believing it too defensive, too passive. American merchant ships continued to sail independently along the eastern seaboard, their navigation lights burning, their hulls outlined against the neon glow of Miami and Atlantic City. The U-boats didn't even need to hunt. They simply waited off the coast and picked their targets like shoppers in a grocery store. In the first 6 months of 1942, German submarines sank 397 ships in American waters. More tonnage was lost off the coast of New Jersey than in all the battles of the Pacific combined. The bodies of merchant sailors washed ashore in Virginia. Oil slicks blackened the beaches of Florida, and still, no air patrols flew overhead. The men of the Kriegsmarine U-boat service expected death. They had been trained for it. They understood that submarine warfare was a mathematical equation in which the variables were courage, skill, and luck, and the constant was the cold Atlantic waiting to crush your hull at 200 meters. They did not expect, however, to find the American coast undefended. They did not expect to surface at night within sight of Coney Island and watch the Ferris wheel turning against the stars. They did not expect to find tankers sailing alone, without zigzagging, without lookouts, without any awareness that a war was being fought. Kapitän-Leutnant Reinhard Hardigan, commanding U-123, recorded his astonishment in his war diary. "It is unbelievable," he wrote. "The Americans have learned nothing." On the night of the 14th of January 1942, Hardigan surfaced off the coast of New York and watched the lights of the city reflect off the low clouds. He could see the Ambrose Light, marking the entrance to New York Harbor. He could see the silhouettes of ships moving in and out of the channel. He radioed Dönitz. "I have arrived in front of New York. Immediate attack possibilities unlimited." Hardigan sank 5 ships in 6 days. He returned to France a hero. He was awarded the Knight's Cross. His crew paraded through the streets of Lorient while a military band played and photographers snapped pictures for the propaganda magazines. The message was clear. Germany was winning the Battle of the Atlantic. And yet, even as the wolf pack celebrated, a quiet unease settled over the veterans. Hardigan, debriefing his officers, remarked on something strange. "The Americans are careless now," he said, "but they will not remain careless. When they wake up, they will bring everything. They always do." The reality was that America did not have an anti-submarine air patrol in 1941 because America did not have the aircraft carriers to provide it. Traditional fleet carriers, the massive ships like Enterprise and Yorktown, were precious assets, far too valuable to risk on convoy escort duty. They were needed in the Pacific, where Japanese carrier task forces prowled the vast distances between Hawaii and Australia. The British had discovered a partial solution. The Escort carrier, a small, slow aircraft carrier converted from merchant hulls. These ships, nicknamed jeep carriers or baby flat-tops, could not fight a fleet action. They carried only 20 or 30 aircraft, mostly obsolete fighters and torpedo bombers. But they could do one thing superbly. They could bring air power to the middle of the ocean, to the Black Pit, to the places where land-based aircraft could not reach. The first British escort carrier, HMS Audacity, joined a convoy in September 1941. She carried 6 Grumman Martlet fighters, American-built planes purchased under Lend-Lease. Her presence transformed the convoy's fate. U-boats, accustomed to attacking on the surface at night, found themselves harassed by aircraft at dawn and dusk. Audacity sank 1 submarine and forced 3 others to break off their attacks. She proved the concept. Then, in December 1941, a coordinated wolf pack overwhelmed her escorts and sent her to the bottom. She had served for 3 months. But those 3 months demonstrated what was possible. The Americans, watching carefully, began construction of their own escort carriers in early 1942. The first, USS Long Island, was a converted freighter. She looked like a cargo ship that had been flattened on top and given a runway. Her maximum speed was 16 knots. Her aircraft elevators broke down constantly. Her crew called her the covered wagon. But she could launch planes, and that was enough. By late 1942, American shipyards were churning out escort carriers faster than the Navy could crew them. The design was simple. Take a merchant hull, add a flight deck, install a hangar, pack the space below with fuel and ammunition. Kaiser Shipbuilding in Vancouver, Washington, could complete one in 3 months. Henry Kaiser, the industrialist who had never built a ship before 1940, applied assembly line techniques borrowed from automobile factories. Welding replaced riveting. Prefabricated sections were built in warehouses and trucked to the shipyard. Standardized parts allowed for mass production. The escort carriers were not elegant. They were not fast, but they floated, they launched planes, and they closed the gap. The symbol that came to define this transformation was not a weapon, it was a meal. Korvettenkapitän Peter Kremer, commander of U-333, was captured in July 1944 after his submarine was sunk by aircraft launched from USS Card, an escort carrier converted from a merchant hull. He spent the remainder of the war in a prisoner of war camp in Louisiana. Years later, in his memoir, Kremer described the moment he understood that Germany had lost the war. It was not when his boat was depth-charged. It was not when he surfaced to find an aircraft overhead. It was in the prisoner of war camp. At breakfast. "We were given eggs," he wrote. "Fried eggs, 2 per man, every morning, and bacon, and white bread, with butter, real butter, not margarine, and coffee, with sugar and cream." Kremer had been at sea for 3 years. His wartime rations had consisted of black bread, canned meat, and ersatz coffee brewed from roasted barley. Fresh food was a distant memory. In the last year of the war, U-boat crews leaving Lorient were issued instructions on how to catch and eat seagulls. "I thought they were trying to fatten us up before sending us somewhere worse," Kremer continued. "But the next morning, the same breakfast. And the morning after that, one of the guards told me this was normal. This was what American soldiers ate every day. I looked at my men, and I saw them realizing the same thing I did. We had been fighting a country that could give eggs and bacon to its prisoners while our own people were starving." Food became the recurring metaphor in the accounts of captured German submariners. It represented something beyond nutrition. It symbolized industrial capacity. A nation that could afford to feed prisoners of war 2 eggs every morning was a nation that could afford to build an escort carrier every 3 months. The same shipyards that launched Liberty ships and tankers were launching aircraft carriers. The same factories that produced tractors and automobiles were producing torpedoes and depth charges. The same farms that exported wheat to Britain were feeding an army of 12 million men. The U-boat crews had expected to fight a naval war. What they encountered was an industrial avalanche. The escort carriers changed the Atlantic War in ways that were both strategic and psychological. Strategically, they closed the Black Pit. By mid-1943, every major convoy crossing the Atlantic had at least one escort carrier attached. The carriers operated in groups, coordinating with destroyers and destroyer escorts to form hunter-killer task forces. These groups did not wait for U-boats to attack. They hunted them. Aircraft from the carriers would patrol in wide arcs ahead of the convoy, using radar and sonar buoys to detect submarines. When a contact was made, the destroyers would race in with depth charges. The submarines, forced to dive, lost their speed and maneuverability. The convoys passed overhead while the U-boats cowered at depth, their batteries draining, their air growing foul. The numbers told the story. In March 1943, the U-boats sank 108 ships. In May 1943, after escort carriers became widespread, they sank 34 ships but lost 41 submarines. Dönitz, reading the loss reports, withdrew his wolf packs from the North Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic was not over, but the turning point had been reached. Psychologically, the carriers destroyed the U-boat crew's morale. Submarine warfare depended on invisibility. The ocean was vast, and a submarine was small. For 2 years, U-boat commanders had surfaced at night, confident that no aircraft could find them in the darkness. Now, planes appeared overhead at all hours, their radar sets painting the ocean with invisible fingers. The night became dangerous. The day became impossible. The safe zones vanished. Heinrich Bleikrott, the commander who had stood in the conning tower in January 1942 and watched the undefended American coast, was killed in February 1945 when U-109 was sunk by aircraft from USS Bogue, another escort carrier. His last radio transmission was a simple report: aircraft overhead, diving. He never surfaced again. The story of the escort carriers was also the story of the men who flew from them. Carrier aviation, even in the relatively calm environment of anti-submarine patrol, was lethally dangerous. The escort carriers had short flight decks, often less than 500 feet. Taking off required perfect timing and nerve. The planes had to reach flying speed before running out of runway. Landing was worse. The carriers pitched and rolled in the Atlantic swells. Pilots had to match their speed to the carrier's motion, catch the arresting wire with their tailhook, and pray that the wire didn't snap. If they missed the wire, they had to take off again, if they had enough fuel. Lieutenant Commander John S. Jack Thush, who helped develop carrier tactics, estimated that 1 in 10 carrier pilots was lost to operational accidents, not enemy action. Planes ran out of fuel and ditched in the ocean. Engines failed on takeoff. Wings folded in rough weather. The crews flew anyway, because the alternative was to let the U-boats win. The aircraft themselves were often obsolete. Many escort carriers flew Grumman F-4F Wildcats, a stubby fighter that had been outclassed in the Pacific by Japanese Zeros. Against submarines, though, the Wildcat was perfect. It was rugged, stable, and could carry bombs or depth charges. Paired with the Grumman TBF Avenger, a torpedo bomber that could loiter for hours on patrol, the Wildcat formed the backbone of the hunter-killer groups. The pilots developed tactics through trial and error. Early in the war, aircraft would drop depth charges and watch them explode harmlessly as the submarine dove out of range. Then someone suggested setting the depth charges to explode at shallow depth, catching the submarine before it could dive deep. This worked better. Another innovation was the Fido acoustic homing torpedo, dropped from an aircraft and guided by the sound of the submarine's propellers. The Germans called it Sonnenkönig the Wren and feared it more than any weapon except radar. By 1944, escort carrier aircraft were sinking U-boats faster than Germany could build them. Not all the victories were measured in sunken submarines. The presence of the escort carriers allowed the convoys to maintain their schedules. This steadiness was itself a victory. The entire Allied strategy in Europe depended on moving men and material across the Atlantic. Every division sent to Britain, every tank unloaded in Liverpool, every gallon of aviation fuel trucked to an airfield in East Anglia had to cross 3,000 miles of ocean. If the convoys were delayed, the invasion of Europe was delayed. If the convoys were stopped, the invasion became impossible. In 1943, the Allies moved 1.3 million tons of supplies across the Atlantic every month. In 1944, that number rose to 2.1 million tons per month. The escort carriers made this possible. They did not win dramatic battles. They did not sink battleships or launch strikes on enemy harbours. They simply kept the sea lanes open, day after day, convoy after convoy, through storms and fog and the long winter nights when the temperature dropped below freezing and ice formed on the flight decks. The British official history of the war at sea, written after the conflict ended, concluded that the escort carriers were the most important weapon system introduced after 1942, not the battleship, not the bomber, the humble, ungainly escort carrier with its 20 outdated aircraft and its crew of 900 men who never expected to be heroes. By the time the war ended, the transformation was complete. The U-boat force that had terrorized the Atlantic in 1942 was shattered. Of the 1,162 U-boats commissioned by Germany during the war, 785 were sunk. The survival rate for U-boat crews was the lowest of any military service in the war. 75% of the men who went to sea in submarines did not come home. They drowned in the dark, or died in the crushing pressure of a depth charge attack, or burned when their batteries exploded, or suffocated when their air ran out. The happy time ended. The hunters became the hunted. The escort carriers continued to serve after the war. Many were converted back to merchant ships. Some were sold to other navies. A few were scrapped, but their legacy remained. They had demonstrated that air power could be brought to any point on the globe, that the gap between land-based aircraft could be closed, that industrial capacity could be turned into strategic dominance. Peter Kremer, the submarine commander who marveled at the eggs and bacon in the prison camp, returned to Germany in 1947. He became a businessman. In his later years, he was interviewed by a British historian writing a book on the Battle of the Atlantic. The historian asked him when he knew Germany would lose the war. In 1942, Kremer said. When the first escort carrier appeared, we could sink ships, but we could not sink factories. The Americans built carriers faster than we could sink them. They built aircraft faster than we could shoot them down. And they fed their prisoners eggs for breakfast. He paused, looking out the window of his office in Hamburg, toward the river where freighters moved in and out of the harbour. We were fighting a war, he said. They were running an industry. The story of the escort carriers is not a story of brilliant generals or daring raids. It is a story of logistics, of incremental improvements, of a problem identified and a solution implemented. It is a story that unfolds in convoy schedules and production tables, in the quiet professionalism of pilots who flew patrol missions over empty ocean, in the determination of a nation that decided the Atlantic would remain open, no matter the cost. But it is also a story about the nature of totalitarian regimes and democratic societies at war. Germany's U-boat campaign was predicated on the idea that Britain could be starved into submission before America's industrial power could be fully mobilized. It was a race against time. If the U-boats could sink enough ships, fast enough, the British would be forced to negotiate. The strategy nearly worked. In 1942, it seemed possible that the Atlantic lifeline might be severed. What the German High Command failed to understand was that America's industrial capacity was not a reserve to be called upon in an emergency. It was a system, functioning at scale, capable of producing not just weapons, but entire categories of weapons that had not existed before. The escort carrier was improvised in 1941 and mass-produced by 1943. The same factories that built them would go on to build the landing ships for D-Day, the floating harbours for Normandy, the tankers and transports and repair ships that kept the Allied war machine supplied. This was not the result of dictatorship. It was the result of a society in which innovation was rewarded, in which factory workers and engineers collaborated, in which problems were solved through experimentation rather than ideology. The escort carriers were designed by naval architects who had never built a warship before. They were constructed by shipyard workers who had been building refrigerators and automobiles in 1940. They were flown by pilots who had learned to fly in crop dusters over Kansas wheat fields. The eggs and bacon that Peter Kremer marveled at were not propaganda. They were the product of a farming system that had been mechanized, that used tractors and combines and hybrid seeds to produce more food than the nation could consume. The surplus fed soldiers and prisoners and allies across the ocean. It was abundance as strategy. On a grey morning in May 1945, the last U-boat surrendered. Oberleutnant Sir C. Klaus Hilgendorf, commanding U-1277, surfaced off the coast of Scotland and radioed his position to the Royal Navy. A British destroyer came alongside. Hilgendorf ordered his crew to scuttle the demolition charges and assemble on deck. They were young men, most of them teenagers, pale and thin from months at sea. They climbed down into the destroyer's launch and were taken ashore. They did not resist. The war was over. Hilgendorf was brought to a debriefing centre near Glasgow. He was given a medical examination, a shower, and a meal. The meal was canned stew, white bread, and tea with sugar. He ate slowly, savouring each bite. An intelligence officer sat across from him and asked routine questions. His boat's patrol area, his crew's condition, his orders from headquarters. Hilgendorf answered mechanically. Then the officer asked a different question. When did you know you would lose? Hilgendorf thought for a long moment. He set down his fork. He looked at the British officer, and then at the plate of food in front of him. When the carriers came, he said, we could hide from the destroyers, we could evade the corvettes, but we could not hide from the planes, and there were always planes. Every convoy had a carrier. Every sea had aircraft. We went from hunters to prey. The British officer nodded and made a note in his logbook. The interrogation continued, but the answer lingered. It was the answer that mattered. The Atlantic is vast and indifferent. It does not remember the battles fought above its surface or the men who drowned beneath its waves. The wreckage of the war lies scattered across the ocean floor, submarines crushed at depth, tankers broken in half, aircraft that ran out of fuel and ditched into the swells. The ocean does not judge. It simply endures. But history remembers. And history records that in 1941, America had no anti-submarine air patrols. The coast was undefended. The convoys sailed alone. The U-boats hunted freely. And then the carriers came. Not the great fleet carriers that dominated the Pacific, but the small, improvised escort carriers built from merchant hulls and crewed by men who had never seen an aircraft carrier before. They closed the gap. They turned the Black Pit into a killing ground for submarines. They kept the convoys moving. They ensured that the supplies reached Britain, that the invasion of Europe could proceed, that the war could be won. They were the embodiment of industrial democracy at war. Practical, efficient, overwhelming. They were the assembly line turned into a weapon. They were the proof that abundance, properly directed, could defeat fanaticism. The U-boat crews expected to fight a naval war. They found themselves fighting an industrial system that could replace losses faster than they could inflict them, that could innovate faster than they could adapt, that could feed its prisoners eggs and bacon while their own country starved. Freedom, it turned out, was not just an ideal. It was a factory running 3 shifts. It was a carrier launching planes at dawn. It was a convoy arriving on schedule, every time, no matter the cost. The hunters learned this the hard way, and the lesson, written in salt water and steel, endured.